Hi, I'm Alexis Teplin. I'm an artist based in London, and I make paintings, performances, and installations that deal with the history of painting through abstraction.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Priyesh Mistry. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects here at the National Gallery. It's a delight to see you all here for the next in our series of Unexpected View talks. This is a series, as some of you may know, where we invite an artist in to choose a painting from the collection to explore some of its themes and to think about some of the shared ideas between the painting and the artist's work. I'm delighted to be standing here in front of Cezanne's painting of Hillside in Provence, produced in the late 19th century, alongside the wonderful Alexis Teplin. Before I go on to introduce Alexis more formally, firstly, we need to thank Hiscox for their support of this evening as the National Gallery's contemporary art partner. These talks are really wonderful. You know, we've done a few of these talks now. Many of them you can see and watch back on our YouTube channel. But they're wonderful in the sense that we get to explore some of the ideas and themes within the painting, but also get a snapshot of how different artists work today. The invitation to Alexis to do this evening's talk comes into another kind of intervention here, taking place here at the gallery in the form of Celine Condorelli's installation, Pentimenti, The Corrections. So if you, after this talk, go around to room 31, you'll see Celine's work. And Celine has been our artist in residence this past year and actually invited Alexis to join her during the year to explore some of the pictures in our gallery. As I've known Alexis's work, really beautiful and thought-provoking work for a number of years now, we thought, actually, this is a really great opportunity to invite you to draw out some of her interest in the gallery's paintings, this idea of the history of painting, and exploring the connections between artists and the spaces that they inhabit. Alexis is an artist that lives and works in London and produces paintings, sculptures, costumes, performances, installations, and films as part of her multifaceted practice. She has taken part in numerous exhibitions in the UK and internationally over the past few decades. More recently, you might have seen her work in exhibitions such as the Mural Commission at the Royal Academy, as part of the Summer Show in 2021, at the Bluecoat in Liverpool, and the New Art Centre at Roche Court in 2019, the London Open in 2018 at the Whitechapel Gallery, and as part of the 20th Biennial of Sydney in 2016, if you were lucky to be in Sydney back then, the Migros Museum in Zurich in 2014, and the Hayward Gallery in their project space in 2013. We will also touch on some of her recent paintings during this conversation that Alexis produced for an exhibition that took place recently in Florida. What makes this evening all the more special is that we're also hosting a special rendition of a performance of Alexis's work titled The Lives of Women, taking place in room 44. Surrounded by works by Manet, Degas, and Monet. And in our conversation this evening, we'll hear a bit more about from Alexis about her interest in these painters and other works in the collection, no doubt, as well. But I think first we should hear from you, Alexis, how we came to choose this work for our conversation this evening. What interested you first about Cezanne as a painter? And then perhaps then we can come to why we came to choose this landscape of all the other Cezanne paintings that we have here.
I mean, I think Cezanne is a funny one for me because I think when you first look at maybe the color in my work and my practice, you wouldn't necessarily automatically associate Cezanne with my work. But what I'm really interested in Cezanne is the way that he builds a painting. So the way that he uses kind of constructive brush marks to kind of form a painting. And what he kind of is really known for, I think, is this use of privileging color over line. So we're not drawing an image, we're actually formulating the objects from different kind of viewpoints and how they situate next to each other. The reason I chose this particular painting, and well, there's quite a few reasons. I think I'm always thinking about 3 or 4 reasons at the same time, which sometimes makes me muddled, but in general, I kind of get through them all. But the first reason really was thinking about the way that the planes of the painting work. And in this series of works, which he started kind of looking at in about 1882, he starts kind of thinking about kind of this linear perspective and building up of different kind of areas of the painting. So you quite often get kind of a central passage within them, and things get broken down within them.
And what is interesting is that he continues that to the landscape behind. Perhaps the fields and the hill actually might not look like this. He might have adapted it in the same way that Van Gogh often does. He sort of slightly augments it. But for sure, it's this interesting way of kind of constructing this view and understanding this sort of place.
I mean, I also think that one of the things that's interesting about returning to the same place again and again is that almost we have this kind of unique relationship to subject, where the subject almost starts to disappear. So we kind of, if we keep returning to the same moment, in a way we're starting to think about abstraction and the way things can kind of fall apart. And I think for me, that's a really important kind of modernist approach that Cezanne had.
I wanted to think also about this idea of Cezanne situating himself within his native landscape, of Provence, of returning and trying to understand his place within it, but also his understanding of that relationship to this world. Provence was really interesting at this moment, where it had numerous people who were very interested in the world and thinking about new ideas. And particularly what was interesting about this moment was this idea of a geological time was being sort of circulated, was becoming part of the discourse at that time. One of his close friends at this time was a geologist, Antoine Fortuné Marion. And they often had discussions around actually the Earth being much, much older than the 6 millennia that they perhaps even thought about, 6,000 years. The period for history was much, much broader than they expected. And I think this fascinated Cezanne. It's interesting that actually then you can almost kind of trace that within this painting, seeing this kind of age or this understanding being kind of worked out. I think this is something interesting in the way that he's describing or trying to work out something through his painting,
And I think that that's actually what interests me in this work as well, is that the paintings are always active. So you're always aware of the maker inside of them. And I think that's something that's really a contemporary notion as well, is that we're always understanding the gesture and the making and the putting together of something.
Can we talk a little bit about how you came to perhaps Cezanne through other painters? I think what's interesting about Cezanne is not only was he had this extraordinary network of peers around him, in the way that artists often do, not just artists, but writers as well. He's also an artist that many painters also look back to as well.
There's this kind of move to talk about Cezanne a lot as this kind of understanding something not from a kind of a different type of perspective. So this looking at the objects and situating the way that the kind of brush strokes and the color creates the form. And so I think that a lot of contemporary artists kind of look to that and think about that. And I was thinking quite a bit about in my recent exhibition also this which has just recently opened in Florida. I was thinking about this kind of distance and the dissidence that we all of a sudden have in relationship to a place or landscape. And I think for me, I think the pandemic did something really where all of a sudden you really started situating, space becomes much further away. So when I was making this recent body of work, I was thinking about this kind of these mountains and this landscape in Northern California that I grew up under and around, and thinking about that in relationship to Cezanne's work and in relationship to painting, not necessarily as a nostalgia, because I'm not interested in that, but in actually a way where we can start to almost think of it almost as a literary kind of moment, so that the way that we interpret a landscape is almost through an imagined kind of text or writing about a space. And what was really interesting to me at this time was that Celine, the artist who has a beautiful show here at the moment, she came back from Morocco and she brought me this book that I have brought today, which was Etel Adnan. And I'm not sure if Celine even realized that I was making this body of work about this kind of Northern California landscape. But when I opened the pages, I came to this kind of mountain. And this mountain really looked like the mountain that I was thinking about, this mountain called Mount Diablo that I grew up under. And Etel Adnan wrote this book in the 80s when I was kind of living there, about a mountain that's across the bay. So I really like this idea that all of a sudden we have a historical, how we think about correspondence rather than dialogue with other artists. So for me, there's this situating of my relationship with contemporary practice through Celine, my relationship with an artist who both writes and paints, who I have an affinity with in that way through Etel Adnan, and then back to Cezanne. So we're always thinking about multiple layers and multiple histories all kind of intersecting at the same time. I thought I would read a little bit about what she says about Cezanne. Is that?
Please do.
There's a couple quotes, so it's really hard to choose. Cezanne or the woman?
Cezanne, I think, yeah.
So, let us return to Cezanne. He is a petrol lamp. His glance lightens the things it touches, a sense that the tragic is always in the quality of a painter's glance, in the moment of choice, in the phenomenon called vision. Cezanne was in love not with the mountain or the gardener or the apples, but with the moment when his glance settled on them differently than when he was promenading or was involved in a conversation. So right there, I think that's what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily the particular place, but it's how we think about that place and how we think about that place as an artist. And I think as an artist, we're always trying to find how we can exist through a type of materiality. And I think that is actually what interests me in art, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Can we talk a little bit about the paintings that you had made for the exhibition?
Yeah.
And the works themselves, the exhibition was called Come Stare, She Makes a Gesture.
Yes, which is a line from the performance that if you stay for the 7:30 performance. So quite often I kind of use language and I use text throughout my work. So within my performance works, what I'm trying to do is almost make the language feel like a painting where it's going in and out of focus. So you might kind of grasp something or be able to kind of hold on to it. And I think that's what also, I think that when we're making paintings or we're talking about painting, we're always invested in a historical language, which is why I'm interested in it. So we always come to it knowing that it's a fallacy, that a painting is an image, that what we're looking at is not real, and we're complicit as a viewer within this negotiation. In my recent body of work, I was thinking about these mountains, I was thinking about landscape. I think something that I always try to do is think about color as the form of the painting. So color is the way we occupy a space, it's the way something moves, but also each painting has a linguistic reference as well. So one of the paintings in the exhibition was called Tamalpayas for this book. So it brings us back to Etel Adnan, and next to that is another painting called Another Mountain. So we have this kind of relationship between my relationship to a mountain, the other painter's relationship to a mountain, and then another painting that was actually called Berkeley for D, which is a reference to Diebenkorn. And Diebenkorn's an important painter for me because I think I remember those paintings as a way of thinking about California. The same way that I think I remember kind of the way that I think about text in terms of the written word. So quite often I'm actually thinking about literary language. So when I'm thinking about California, I'm thinking about Joan Didion trying to write about a place, or John Steinbeck kind of trying to locate a place, and how the language actually, in a funny way, talks about kind of painting in this kind of really amazing way where you start to think about the dustiness, you start to think about the yellows, you start to think about the burnt kind of quality of color in landscape. And I think I was trying to get the paintings to do that. So I guess I'm always thinking about an exhibition as a group or a body of work and how they relate to each other. So also within this exhibition, there was a painting called Belle for Vanessa Bell, and that one has a much more kind of an interior kind of feel to it. So I'm thinking about how something feels, right? So a landscape which is expansive in some of the works, and then another landscape which actually feels like a woman looking through a window, which I think is the history of women making paintings potentially. So I'm always thinking about a million things at the same time, and I'm trying to kind of somehow grasp onto them and kind of let them kind of float away in a painting.
I think it's quite a pertinent moment to think about actually viewing and understanding a landscape that actually you both sort of shared in different perspectives, but also a kind of approach that I think, or a way of approaching an understanding of painting, or the way that you might produce a painting.
Yeah, so this is, so quite often I'm thinking about the way women sit in the world. I think probably because I am one, it's something that I think about quite a bit. And so this is a quote that's really beautiful. Each woman is a mountain. I remember those barren hills, ochre, yellow, amber-like, dry and crissing under the feet, quivering on warm nights, shrieking pain in summers of sun-like violence. I remember orange-colored mountains worshipped silently by dissident tribes. I remember plateaus fornicating with wind and dust, burning with desire, exploding in volcanoes under the earthly malediction. I remember that mountains are women. And I think that's just something that's really beautiful. I think quite often when I'm writing a performance, I'm thinking about this position of how we interact within our own community, and then how that can be represented historically. And so quite often when I lift text, it will come from places, novelists and writers, and then also be incorporated with my own writing. So for example, and then thinking about how that can kind of relate back to painting. So in this particular performance, there's a moment where the actor says, talks about a bath. She says, we wash first our face, then our hands, and then our feet. And then the other actor says, position of the workers. And for me, that was, and for me, that moment was talking directly about Degas and thinking about an image of a painting. So quite often, and that was something that I was having dinner with the actor, and she mentioned this exact sentence to me, and I thought, oh, that's like a Degas painting. So all of a sudden, there's this fragmentation between the contemporary language and me remembering a painting. And then somehow trying to bring that back into this gallery as an image next to an image. And so I think I'm always trying to do that, like create this abstract moment where things are opening up and falling apart and folding in on each other. And that the performances actually are a way to make a painting active. So I think quite often we go into a gallery and the paintings can almost feel like they're fixed or they're of a different time. And somehow I want the performance to slow us down and make us look around us. So you might be inside it, you might be outside of it, you might, it kind of does what Proust does, I think, maybe not. But it has this kind of folding, kind of poetic moment, I think, maybe.
And in a sense, I think that's something interesting just to reflect back on Cezanne again, and the work where, we've just often described it as a way of him trying to understand that space and understand what that landscape is, but working out through, the act of painting in a sense, and thinking about perhaps even, Cezanne was so inventive or so incredible in the language that he developed to describe a form. And you can see that it's so brilliant within this landscape. This is I love that we can focus on this work. It's the smallest work on this wall, surrounded by so many other fantastic, iconic masterpieces. And it's almost like a work that you could almost get lost in these planes, I find that really interesting that actually we can activate that thinking all over again. Going back to the idea of making paintings active within a space, can we talk a little bit about the way that you might construct an installation for an exhibition, and then perhaps specifically thinking about the performance that we are hosting this evening, The Lives of Women, how that first evolved, and the thoughts and the ideas that you were thinking of in producing that performance?
Yeah, so whenever so I think probably my exhibition at the Bluecoat is a good one to talk about here, but the first thing I do, and I think this comes from also, probably also comes from being taught in Los Angeles by kind of contemporary conceptual artists. I think so. I wasn't really taught in terms of painting, so I'm always locating painting as a language within another space. So for me, coming into the Bluecoat, the first thing I wanted to do was rearrange the architecture. So I took walls out. I thought about how the performances could actually get the audience to move through the space, and I'm always thinking that the performances own the space. So it's something that Gertrude Stein talks about in her American lectures, that when you are you're in a theater performance, and I think that she talks about it because she doesn't like it, but it's the reason I really like performance, is that you're always aware of your body. So when you're watching someone else act or perform, you're aware of your own uncomfortableness in a space. So that's something that I quite like to use in an exhibition, and how we kind of can move through a space. I'll work with other kind of practitioners to make things. So working with a glass blower to make a still life that actually has a reference from a Morandi painting or a Matisse painting. And so the objects go from being full to flat to full again. And I like that, and that you're having this conversation with a maker making something, so that the work actually happens through a translation. So the communication of an artwork is through multiple voices and through multiple materialities. And that to me sets up painting in a different kind of dialogue. So all of a sudden we're talking about painting, we're thinking about painting through what it's positioned next to. And so that's how I always work, even when I'm doing just a painting show. So in that show, I was just talking about how the paintings sit next to each other. Somehow the titling becomes very, very important, as it kind of like centers how each painting kind of works off each other.
And in the way that the costumes are constructed as well, using different materials, different kinds of fabrics from different periods.
Yeah, so I always kind of use historical fabrics that I find, and I kind of mix them together and kind of, so again, the fragmentation happens in every which way. So the actual fabric of the way something is made has a relationship. So the particular costumes that we're going to see in the other room have kind of French brocade and Italian 18th century brocade kind of mashed into it. So you almost have this other presence of kind of the fabric, or what might kind of pop out in relationship to the body. And again, I work with a pattern cutter, and I kind of design them and think about them and make them. And they all have titles that relate to like people that I know or people that I think about. So they have this kind of very kind of moment of having a relationship to the historical fabrics, but then to this kind of very contemporary kind of community that I live in. I guess that makes sense. And then I think we were going to talk about, so the lives of women, which is the piece that we'll see. Quite often for me, making a performance is also, I'm really not interested in something being fixed. So I'm always trying to use, so every opportunity I think about as a way to make a piece of work. So when Priyesh invited me to have a performance here, what I started thinking about is, what can I do to activate this performance in a different way? And how can I think about shifting the language to work inside what it's next to? And so originally, the piece that I started with, I wrote it right at the same time as we first started having the women's marches in America. So it was pre-pandemic. And so I was thinking about, how do we situate ourselves in relationship to protest, and what does that mean? And how can we or can we not kind of be active and this kind of moment of being passive in a situation and wanting to be active. And so this piece was kind of written with all those things in mind. And I looked at the May Day rooms, the archive there, and this kind of early kind of manifesto about communication from 1968, which was by the Bash Street Kids. I was looking at Iris Murdoch's letters to Raymond Queneau in the 30s. And she was kind of, and there's an archive at Kingston University where I teach, and I was looking at that, and I was thinking about how those kind of, those letters kind of talk about communication in a way. So it's about trying to translate something from French to English, and the impossibility of that at that exact moment. And I think in the 30s is this kind of really interesting moment also in the, that pre-war kind of the impetus for something to change or wanting something to change. And then there are probably tons of other little references in there. There'll be something that I said to someone or someone said to me. I think that there's, all sorts of things.
I think I wanted to bring it back to this idea of correspondence, because this is something that you often talk about in the way that you construct and build these kind of, take these references, these quotations from different places, from the Murdoch letters to other places, but allowing these references to then connect with one another, but not in the sense of responding or having a sort of a clash perhaps, but actually to think about it as a form of writing letters or corresponding over time, over sense, over connections or friendships perhaps even.
Well, what I always think about too is rhythm. So I think when I'm thinking about a painting, I'm thinking about the hum that it makes and the sound that it has and the presence that it has. So how color can be this moment where things kind of all of a sudden coalesce and hover. And I'm trying to do the exact same thing with language. So there's always a rhythm into the writing. So actually, the first thing I do when I'm working with the actors is I lie down on the floor and I listen to them. And I go, okay, the rhythm, that, and then I make them move things around and really stress them out. But so a lot of it has to do with this kind of rhythm and the correspondence between different voices. And a lot of it is my own writing as well. And actually, oddly, the more poetic or romantic bits tend to be things that I stick in there to kind of soften it. But yeah, so there's that kind of correspondence, I think, between the different voices within the pieces. And then I think I always, whenever I work with actors too, I'm working with their presence. I'm not asking them to be someone other than themselves. So they kind of get to occupy the space and this kind of intimate relationship with each other on stage. And trying to get to language almost to kind of soften. In this particular piece, what I'm really excited about is I was trying to do is almost Orlando it. So I wanted them to flip places. And that's something I've been wanting to do for a really long time, is see what happens when actors reverse positions and the language and the voice changes. So sometimes I do it with different accents or different people playing the same part. So my films are always films that also take the place of being like the representation of the work. So I don't actually document the performances within kind of this space. The documentation is actually a pre-made film of the performance that exists as a whole thing. And so in that way, quite often when something is replayed by a different actor, I'm still thinking about how their relationship and their voice is a different interpretation of that film. A lot of the gestures I use are also lifted from other performances and different things. So when we initially started drafting this performance and thinking about its location, we were actually looking at Celine's space and the Poussin paintings within that space, who is someone that Cezanne was really interested in as a way of kind of thinking about the flatness and the movement through a painting. And also, if you look at those paintings, the color, it's quite interesting, the relationship between the color between the two painters. But so there'll be a gesture that we actually took from those early rehearsals back into the space in this final performance. So you'll have gestures from the paintings that are around them. You'll have gestures from paintings from other spaces. And then, and there'll be gestures from life as well.
I think I want to bring it back to Cezanne to kind of sort of encapsulate all of those ideas and those ways of working back into Cezanne's painting, in a sense. When we think about perhaps the idea of gesture or color to kind of create this sort of dense color of meaning, perhaps, I'd like what you said just now about using color to construct something, to construct this sort of dialogue or these correspondence. And in a sense, I feel that that's also what we can see in this, that he's using color and composition in a way to construct a painting, not necessarily to give us an understanding and a deeper understanding of this landscape and this place, but actually to understand what painting might be.
Yeah, and that there's always a complete awareness of Cezanne of the materiality of paint and his struggle with that materiality, which I think is so beautiful. It's always this moment where I think that if you finally figure it out, then it's kind of over. And you always see with Cezanne's painting that he's always trying to figure out the next thing and how to build it and how to change it and how to kind of interact with it. And I think that that's always really mesmerizing. That awareness of the excavation of the paint and the building on top and the pulling back.
I think that's the perfect place to end our talk this evening.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Alexis for joining us this evening and for choosing this wonderful Cezanne.